welcome back to Kickback. My name is Ben Strasser, and I'm now joined by my friend Tammy. Tammy, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Tammy, through our discussions over the numerous years that we've had you on, you have personally helped me so much navigate different griefs that I've gone through, which is a part of what we're going to be talking about today. But I just appreciate your mission as a grief recovery specialist, and what you've done for me and my family and our community through that as well. So thank you.
Oh, thanks.
So first up, something that I've experienced and something that I've seen you talk about recently is just the idea of the word grief and what it carries, and how for some people that can be a barrier to maybe seeking help. Can you elaborate on that?
It is. I don't know why our society puts this really yucky feeling on grief, but they do. And it's so ingrained in us that I know as myself, as a grief recovery specialist, I'll be at a party one night and somebody, I'll meet somebody new and I'll ask them, what do you do? And they'll say, oh, I'm a grief counselor. And my first physical reaction is, ugh, right?
Yeah.
And then I have to pause and I have to stop and I say, wait a minute, that's what you do. And, I think it goes all the way back in history, especially for women, because if you look around the town of Paris, you'll see what's called widow walks at the top of the houses. And it was like if you were grieving the loss of your husband, say, you were segregated from society. The only outdoor air you could get was to go on these widow walks. And so as we move through society, it almost becomes something you're ashamed of. It's something you want to hide. And yet the irony of the whole situation is grief is the most natural thing we do. And our bodies are designed to process these emotions and release them. But we're taught to store them and treat our bodies like storage facilities. And like any piece of equipment not used properly, it starts to break down.
Right. And you shared about, I think it's a generational thing of not sharing your grief, but I know a lot of people do struggle with just even voicing the fact that they have grief, let alone that they're struggling. And I know from my personal, just having different conversations, that a lot of people don't know that is what they're experiencing. And I think there's power in being able to name something. So can you just share a little bit about what grief, I know we talked about the idea of there's 40 or more reasons that people grieve.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Ben. So what I'd like the listeners to do is just filter their experience through these 5 statements. So grief is an emotional loss of any kind. Grief is the conflicting feelings brought up by a change in something that was familiar. It's about the things that we wished had been better, different, or more. It's about our unrealized hopes, dreams, and expectations. And it's about things that have been left unsaid. So when you think in your mind it's the death of a loved one or a divorce, which is kind of the 2 topics that we're allowed to kind of put in that category, the other 40 plus reasons why we grieve fall into those categories. And we've talked before, it's also choices that we've made, things that we know are in our best interest, supposedly happy things. But if we don't grieve the conflicting emotions that surround those choices, we can sabotage the life that we're building for ourselves.
I know from my personal experience, until I had met you, I didn't realize that grief looked like 40 plus different things.
Yeah.
And so the loss of a business, the change in a relationship, going from being single to being married.
Yeah.
It's a super positive thing and a happy thing and a thing that is good for you.
Right.
But it's there's that life beforehand, and then you introduce children into the mix, and then there's grief in the relationship that you had with your partner before the kids came into the picture and what that looked like. And then that repeats when you have a second one, from personal experience. But you can have those positive things, and that can be conflicting in the fact that you have something so happy, but paired with that loss of something, but you don't necessarily know that is what that is because nobody talks about it.
No, and I don't think we give each other permission to grieve that, because if you say, You know, if you say to one of your friends, you know, wow, like I kind of miss poker night, or I miss, you know, going out on motorcycle, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, if you say that, you get judged for, yeah, but you're a dad now, right? But no, those feelings are very real. I said to my daughter the other day, she has 2 little kids, and I said, do you ever remember what your life was like before kids? And she goes, no. No, I don't. Because she's just so sleep deprived, right?
Yeah.
And focused. We talked about it. You're in survival mode in those first 2 years. And that's when you really have those emotions to grieve. So you can really enjoy being a parent.
With the birth of our first son, it wasn't what we expected.
No.
It wasn't what was planned. No. And there was a traumatic piece to it where it was like Theo came out, and then he was taken away to the NICU, and he was there for 7 days. And that was, I just remember being in the shower, like just crying, because that was not like, you're like, this little human is here, and now what do we do? And we didn't really have any answers, and seeing him hooked up to all these machines, it was traumatic. And then there was, with Benny, our second, there was a lot of redemption. And the fact of like his birth came in, and it was much more of a normal, like stereotypical one. And there was just a lot of redemption in that, and a lot of healed emotions by experiencing that in that way.
Well, and you know, something else that's not talked about is, I really believe as a grief recovery specialist that we set our new parents up for failure, because we create this illusion, you know, it's going to be this euphoric experience. But then when we are sleep deprived and we're grieving that other life, and we're maybe living in some sense of regret, maybe, we just don't feel that we have permission to grieve that, because, well, nobody else must feel this because parenthood is supposed to be amazing. No, it's the most challenging thing you'll ever do, right? And yes, don't get me wrong, I love my kids and I'm glad I had the experience, but I've also gone back and grieved those emotions that I didn't know existed, and it did shift things for me.
Can you explain how like unresolved grief can pop up in everyday life?
Well, I think the best way to explain that is, we're taught to bury these emotions. We're taught not to speak of them ever again. But yet every current, present experience we have, or any future experience we have, gets filtered through our past if it hasn't been resolved. And so we may have triggers, we call them triggers, where all of a sudden you're reacting. You're not responding, you're reacting to a stimuli, and you don't even realize that it's nothing to do with what's happening right now in the moment. It's being filtered by those unresolved emotions. And what our body will do is it will just keep turning up the volume to get our attention. So it might be we are not eating the same, we're not sleeping the same, maybe our nervous system is really on high alert, but it will just keep turning up the volume until we turn our attention to that. And sometimes it shows up in physical symptoms if that's what it takes to get our attention. And I remember reading this book, it just blew my mind. This gentleman had cancer on his leg, and he said to his wife and his kids, I need to go on a holiday by myself. I need to come to resolve about my situation. And so he went away, and while he was gone, he realized that he was an artist and he'd given up that dream to work in his dad's roofing business. So think about it, you're an artist and you go into the skilled trades. Not that there's anything wrong with the skilled trades, but that's not a match. And when he resolved all those emotions, he got onto the plane and he went to scratch his leg, and he realized that the tumor on his leg had completely fallen off.
Wow.
Because all he needed to do, and I'm not saying that all medical conditions are that easy to resolve, but in this particular situation, the tumor was his body's way of saying, you're not living an authentic life. You need to leave your dad's business and follow your true heart. So,
thank you for sharing that. And for somebody that's watching at home and maybe through this discussion is thinking, you know what, I do have some unresolved things that I need to work through, what would you say their first steps are that they could take?
the first step is we have to be aware that we want something different. And we have to be aware that we are carrying these unresolved emotions. And for some people, maybe not necessarily men, but they're welcome to do it. But women can journal. And journal certainly isn't the way you heal those emotions. But what it does is it gives you the opportunity to give them a name, and it gives you permission to feel them. We can't change anything in our lives if we're not aware that there's something that we need to change. So that's where it all starts. And being open to the discussion. People who follow me on social media know that I post a lot about this stuff. And the reason that I do is I just want to normalize the conversation. I want it to be a word that people don't run from, people don't shut down, people like me don't, feel yucky about. I want it to be as acceptable as any other word in our language. And I think a nice way to wrap that thought up is if your child came home and had a great day at school, you would sit down and you would share that experience with them. But if they come home and they say, somebody stole their lunch or somebody tripped them in the hall, what we do is we want to shut down that conversation because it's uncomfortable for us too. And we want to replace that loss with a cookie or a glass of milk or maybe, something on the TV. And so we learn at a very early age to shut down that word, to shut down those emotions. And we really need to relearn how to welcome them into our conversations.
So Tammy, what does life feel like on the other side of those unresolved emotion? What's possible?
Oh my goodness, so much is possible. It's so cool. So I'm going to use myself as a personal example. I have lived my life in fight or flight most of my adult life. If you met me, you would see the same person you see today. But what's different is back then I was like the duck with its feet under the water. I was paddling and paddling, trying to convince you and myself that I was okay. And when I discovered grief and resolving all of those emotions, what I found was an inner peace that I didn't think was possible. I lived my life people-pleasing, trying to validate my own worth by how other people saw me. I said yes when I wanted to say no. My whole life really was trying to be accepted and to fit in. And I think what's really changed is with this inner peace, I want to belong now. And rather than to respond or react to situations, I want to respond. And I want to choose that response. But when your emotions are in charge, you're not really participating fully. You're reacting, and you're reacting being dictated by the past instead of the present. And so, we push this down. We don't think it's important. It's at the bottom of the list. But really, you show up differently as a parent. You show up differently as a friend. You show up differently as an employee or an employer, because you're really able to step into your authentic self, and you're able to build a life focused in the direction that you want to go in instead of being dictated by your emotions.
Amazing. And something that I wanted to share based on what you had shared earlier about the idea of holding on to things that aren't necessarily theirs to hold on, right? It's a generational piece. And there was a moment where I looked at my son, who has a resemblance to me, and I remember having it worked up all of these emotions inside of me that I didn't realize were there, and they weren't mine to hold, but it changed how I was showing up in life based on seeing myself in him subconsciously and not realizing. And then the moment that I was able to work through that and realize what that was, it was just really fascinating to know that we all carry so much. And a lot of it is grief, unresolved grief. And it just was fascinating to me to see how that showed up in my life. And I just would invite everybody watching at home to kind of take a look and to journal or to take stock of how they're showing up in the world, and maybe things have changed. And I know for me personally, recently, how I'm reacting to my oldest son is different than how maybe I had before. And it's just life has changed now with having two. And life's busy, and so just taking stock of that and knowing that I want to show up better and I want to be there in a different way, it's just really, it's empowering to know that, just to take stock just to know and see how you're doing that and really reflect on that.
Well, and I think too, you asked me, how do we discover this? And maybe now it's time to take a different role in friendships and allow that safe place for men to just sit down and say, I had a bad day today. Can I just have a safe place just to vent?
Right, and that's what we saw at the Beacon program
Yes.
that I led with
Yes.
Kids Can Fly. The feedback that we received was that the dads voiced that it was the grief topic that we touched on, the mental health and the grief topic that we touched on, that brought the most impact to them in how they were showing up in their lives. And what we saw across that was that the dads, because they're way more involved than they ever have been,
Right.
Like these dads are solo at the library with their baby that is under a year old, and just like interacting with all of us and talking and sharing that experience. And because of that, they're starting to experience a lot of the same things, myself included, that the moms maybe more so stereotypically spoke of and shared. And so because their dads are being more involved, they're starting to experience the isolation and the loneliness in that transition, in that grief, right, of grieving what was before. And I just love that concept of being able to wanting to respond instead of react. And I just really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, no, what you're doing is really, really important work. And it's funny, we're watching a TV show, and one of the doctors decided that he would start a men's group. And it was really interesting because at first no one showed up. And then one person showed up, and then two. And then by the time it had established itself, there was a regular gathering of men on a regular basis doing exactly just what you just shared. So it's very important work. Women may have the opportunity to vent. We may not have the right tools to vent, but we vent, and it's accepted. But men are supposed to push something down in a place that'll never be spoken of again, and that puts you at a very big disadvantage.
Right, and then that's where it starts to show up. That trauma, that unresolved trauma, starts to show up as really negative things. And it's important to bring those things to light, to show up best for ourselves, for our families, for our friends. It's important to share these and to be vulnerable, and just help normalize those conversations around grief.
I think what's really important to note in this conversation is we've become very disconnected. We've become disconnected from each other, especially with all our technology. We think we're connected, but really we're not. But we're also very disconnected from ourselves, which comes back to that awareness piece. And when we reconnect with our own heart, we're more open to reconnect with the hearts of others. And that creates a much different conversation than the ones we've had in the past. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Tammy. I really appreciate you taking the time.